And that's the recent update. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Alex, who is a farm conservation advisor with FWAG Southwest. Been fortunate enough to work with him for a couple of years, and it's great to see your face again, Alex. So over to you if you're happy to share your screen. And I think you're going to be talking through AB9, which is winter bird food, and a couple of grassland options. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Right, I shall quickly introduce myself. I work for FWAG, the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group. So we're just a quick summary of FWAG. We're a membership organisation established in the 1960s by farmers. FWAG Southwest is an offshoot of FWAG. We were established in 2012. We're a charity. We operate in the southwest, so from sort of Cornwall up to Gloucestershire and Wiltshire. We've got about 60 employees, including about 49 advisors. I say about, we're always sort of changing. And we're also members of the FWAG Association, so the wider group, which includes FWAG groups in the east and so forth. Our vision, as it were, is to promote and enhance the conservation of wildlife and the environment and the landscape in relation to modern agriculture. So we're working with farmers to have an element of their farm managed for wildlife, for soil and water, and so forth. In the past, I would say it was very much wildlife focused, but it's broadened out much more than that now, to the point I would say we're almost led by the sort of the soil and water side of things. But yeah, it's all sort of part and parcel. So we've got advisors with a mix of specialisms relating to soil and water, agronomists working for us, wildlife side of things, which is more my side, as well as woodland specialists. And we assist our members doing work such as, for example, countryside stewardship applications, farms and woodland creation, natural flood management, cross compliance, slightly less of an issue these days as we're sort of phasing into the environmental land management schemes, and also wildlife surveys. I, for example, do pollinate surveys. And then in addition to that, we also get involved with the sort of farmer groups, whether they be funded through countryside stewardship, such as facilitation funds, or private sort of farmer groups, and various projects. So we've got Hills to Levels, which is a large project in Somerset with European funding involving the Environment Agency, the Rivers Authority, and so forth. We do a plastic recycling scheme. We're involved with delivering advice on behalf of Natural England, the Rural Payments Agency in some instances, Great Crested Newts and assurance schemes for supermarkets and that sort of thing. So a fairly sort of broad brush, wide range of things. Anyway, the selfless promotion aside, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about four grants that are available in countryside stewardship, and just sort of talk around them. So what I've tried to do is choosing a range of options which are applicable to different types of farmland. So I've chosen winter bird food, which is can be applied to arable land, permanent grassland with very low inputs, permanent pasture, legume and herb-rich swards, a bit of a hybrid, and I've also chosen one capital item. So the first three are what you might call revenue options, which are included in, for example, a mid-tier agreement and lasts the 5 years, whereas the planting the standard hedgerow tree is a capital item. That's a sort of a one-off payment, something you can do in the first 2 years of your 5-year mid-tier. So winter bird food. So for those of you that have arable land, cropland on your farm, this is a fantastic option, I think. It pays reasonably well. It pays £640 per hectare per annum over the 5 years of your agreement. And essentially, it's to produce seed for farm and birds. Our sort of modern advances in agriculture have been absolutely fantastic in increasing yields and so forth. But what they have slightly sort of rung the death knell for is a lot of the more what I would call beneficial weeds you would have got in arable crops. Those weeds, red shank, fat hen, and so forth, charlock, provided seed for farm and birds. Now, as I'm sure you hope they're not in your crop, so what we're looking at doing is providing an alternative source of seed. And winter bird food potentially provides exactly that. So I've got a photo here. In the photo, you can see kale in the background. This is a biennial crop, so as you appreciate, it isn't producing any seed in the first year, but it bolts in the second spring, goes to flower, and then produces a fantastic source of small seed for a wide range of birds. You've got the quinoa or quinoa, pronounce that what you will, which is a relative of fat hen, comes from South America. That's a sort of purple and sort of yellowy one. Again, a really good source of seed. And then you've also got in the background some triticale, which is a cereal. So yeah, a really good option. The sort of you increase the length of your crop by including kaolin. So you're sort of halving your establishment costs, and good proven crop types to include would be, for example, kale, quinoa, and millet. So, for example, red millet, white millet. Other things that are beneficial include fodder radish. Fodder radish produces those sort of chili pods, which I'm not sure if they're hugely popular with birds because they tend to sort of remain pretty much uneaten through most of the winter. But the benefit of that being that if it is a particularly harsh winter, all the other seed has gone. You know, for example, quinoa goes quite early, the millet a little later, and at the end of the winter into early spring, sometimes the fodder radish is left, and therefore if you get a really hard snap, then the birds think, okay, well, we'll taste buds aside, and we can sort of pile into that. So that's another good thing. If you are putting mixes in, you can include cereals. I would describe cereals, generally speaking, I like to talk about cereals, wheat, barley, triticale, as relatively cheap fillers. So they don't cost so much to include. That's whether you do your own mixes, you would buy it off the shelf. But that said, they're not quite so popular with a number of birds. So yes, they're eaten by the likes of yellowhammer, which is brilliant. But a lot of the stuff, such as I think I've got a photo of a goldfinch here, linnet and those sort of species, they tend to eat the smaller seed, so less good for that. So just something to bear in mind. Anyway, so this is an option which you can apply to arable land or temporary grassland. And just things to bear in mind is each crop, each plot, I should say, has got to be more than 0.4 of a hectare, no more than 5 hectares. You can rotate it around the field, and a really good option to include if you can to benefit farm and birds. And also the crop also has scope to provide invertebrates and that sort of thing at other times of year. So next option I chose is for those of you that, for example, may not have arable land, but have got permanent pasture. Now, the option which jumps out would be species-rich grassland. So there's an option called GS6, Management Species-Rich Grassland, which is absolutely wonderful. Species-rich grassland contains lots and lots of wildflowers, which is absolutely brilliant for pollinators and all sorts of things. But species-rich grassland is relatively rare these days. A lot of you may not have it. So what I've gone for is I've gone for a more sort of bog standard grassland option, which is grassland with very low inputs. So this is an option which has scope to benefit various objectives under the scheme. It can be to try and create more interesting, diverse grassland with flowers in. So this isn't a particularly sort of extraordinary photo. You've got some of the sort of dandelion family in there, so the likes of sort of cat's ear, autumn hawkbit. You can see an oxeye daisy in there. So it's not extraordinary, but it's beginning from a wildlife perspective. It's beginning to get a bit more interesting. It's got a bit more diversity in there, more diversity in terms of species, flower structures, and that sort of thing. And with that diversity of species of plants and flower structures, so you get a greater diversity of invertebrates, bees, hoverflies, butterflies, etc., able to sort of to benefit from it. And the very low inputs essentially is going to help move that grassland in that sort of direction. So probably, you know, it's not brilliant for productivity. Perhaps you can still graze it, still get a cut of it, but it's helping from that aspect. But this option can also be applicable to, for example, buffering watercourses. So if you've got grassland fields next door to a watercourse with the low input, that benefits that, and can also benefit historic features as well. If you look at the payment, it's gone up. So it's gone up to £132 per hectare per annum, which is good news. It used to be sort of 90-something pounds last year. So that's a benefit. It can only be applied whole parcel, and you've got various prescriptions which, for example, prevent you from taking a cut of it before the end of June. You can't supplementary feed on it apart from mineral blocks, and obviously you've got limited fertilizer inputs. But that's a good option, you know, on perhaps some of your more marginal fields, humpy bumpy fields, to actually sort of encourage the great diversity of wildflowers, which in turn benefits the wildlife. And here I've got a photo of a painted lady, which is one of our migrant butterflies. They don't overwinter in this country, and so this is a species which is essentially coming up from Africa, coming through Europe, visits our country in varying numbers depending upon the year. And here it's found a bit of black knapweed, the purple flower, to feed on. The grassland with very low inputs is perhaps not a hugely productive option from an agricultural perspective. So the next option I chose is a bit of a hybrid, Legume and Herbrick Swards. So this is a short to medium term sward, which might be lasting you about sort of 5 years. It can be grown on arable land, temporary grassland. It can be grown on permanent pasture, but only if it's been cultivated and reseeded within the last 5 years. And this is hopefully something which is productive from your perspective. So good yields in terms of grazing, in terms of silage. You can cut it, you can clamp it, you can brown bale it, but also has benefits in that it's got, from a livestock point of view, it's got sort of deeper rooting species in there, chicory, plantains, more drought resistant, bring up different minerals and so forth. But from the wildlife perspective, you've got flowers in there that can provide food for pollinators. It's also potentially good at increasing the soil organic matter. I've got a sort of slightly lewd picture of some mating earthworms. And so it's it's potentially a really good option for those of you that are, you know, growing some forage, finishing livestock, dairy cattle, whatever else. It's a bit of a leap into the unknown for many, and so it's something that perhaps you can look at and give it a trial. And at a payment of £358 per hectare, it is definitely worth considering. That's one to consider. And then the last one I've chosen, as I say, is a capital item: planting a hedgerow tree. I chose this photo advisedly. It's an oak. It's looking a bit stag-headed, a bit sorry for itself, may even be on the way out, which is actually the case with quite a few of our hedgerow trees around the countryside, and they're not really being replaced. So there are various capital items available under countryside stewardship to plant hedges, to lay hedges, to coppice hedges, to fence hedges, and this is one of those capital items which you might want to consider. I think it's really worthwhile to actually sort of reverse the tide and actually getting a few more standard hedgerow trees. And we always think generally speaking, I think of hedgerow trees being sort of classic, such as oak, common oak, or for example ash. But also, I mean, why not consider shrub species as well? I appreciate this is actually a hedge which has grown tall, but actually having a standard hawthorn hedgerow tree, I think, is almost just as valuable as oak. You can see these hawthorn full of blossom, which is absolutely brilliant source of early pollen nectar for invertebrates in spring. We're also we've gone through goat willow as flowers, the blackthorn's perhaps flowering now. We're just coming into the time when the may's beginning to flower. So yeah, you could think of other species as well, whether it be crabapple, field maple, whatever else is your hedgerow trees. Yeah, so I've just given you a run of a number of options, and I shall hand back to Dan.